Vlas Yakovlevich Chubar was born on February 22, 1891, in Fedovka, in the Yekaterinoslav Governorate of the Russian Empire, now modern-day Ukraine, to an ethnic Ukrainian peasant family. His parents were illiterate peasants who owned a small plot of land. At the age of 13, he was arrested and beaten by police for belonging to a revolutionary group. After leaving school, he worked as a roofer, and became a Marxist during the 1905 revolution and joined the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party in 1907. He was a senior figure in Vesenkar, in Moscow, and the Urals, from 1918 to 1920. Chubar returned to Ukraine that year, where he held a succession of economic posts, including running the Don Basin coal combine from 1922 to 1923. He was a member of their Central Committee of the Ukrainian Communist Party from 1920 to 1936, and of the Politburo. In 1922, he was elected a member of the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party. On July 13, 1923, Chubar replaced Christian Rakovsky as chairman of the Ukrainian Sovnarkom. In the early 1920s, Chubar tried to resist allowing Ukraine to be controlled from Moscow. In 1920, he objected to the appointment of a Russian, Vyacheslav Molotov, as secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party, claiming that he knew very little about conditions in Ukraine, and Molotov ended up being recalled after a year. In 1925, he objected to the appointment of Vlas Kaganovich who, like Molotov, was a crony of Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, as first secretary of the Ukrainian Party. Their working relationship reached breaking point in 1928, and Stalin recalled Kaganovich, whose replacement, Stanislav Kozyor, was much more acceptable to the Ukrainian leadership. Chubar became a non-voting candidate member of the Central Committee's Politburo in November 1926, one of the few ethnic Ukrainian to reach this level. He supported Stalin in his struggle against his nemesis Leon Trotsky in the 1920s and made a speech attacking Trotsky and others at the Central Committee session in October 1927. Chubar had originally backed Stalin's decision to force peasant farmers to join collective farms. He was one of the speakers at a crucial session of the Central Committee in November 1929 who attacked Nikolai Bukharin and others who opposed forced collectivization. In March 1930, he reported that 63% of peasant households in Ukraine had been collectivized. On February 1, 1932, despite evidence that this policy was creating a catastrophic fall in agricultural output and even mass starvation, Chubar and Kozyor co-signed an order called, On Seed, ordering regional, city and district party committees to deny any seed aid to Ukraine's collective farms. This was their first of 3 documents bearing this signature, from which the Kyiv Court of Appeal reached its verdict that Chubar was complicit in genocide. Chubar saw the impact of collectivization for himself when he visited the countryside. On June 10, 1932, he wrote to Stalin and Molotov warning that, in March and April there were tens of thousands of malnourished, starving and swollen people dying from famine in every village. A few days later, with the backing of the Ukrainian Politburo, he sent a telegram to Moscow pleading for thousands of tons of grain to be sent to Ukraine. Stalin's said, Chubar is mistaken, Ukraine has been given more than it should get. There is no reason to give more grain, and nowhere to take it from. His requests for more grain angered Stalin, who gave Kaganovich and Molotov a written instruction on July 2 to go to Ukraine to deal with what he termed Chubar's corruptness and opportunism, and hinted that both Chubar and Kozyor would be removed from Ukraine. Kaganovich reported to Stalin that every member of the Ukrainian Politburo pleaded for a reduction in the quota of grain Ukraine was supposed to hand over, but he and Molotov categorically refused. In Pravda, the following day, Chubar was quoted as having criticized heads of collective farms and other officials who accepted targets they knew could not be fulfilled, saying, "It is wrong to accept an order regardless of its practicability and then to justify the resulting chaos by saying it came from orders from above." But, after the Politburo session, Chubar and Kozyr signed a decree called, "On Grain Procurement's Quota," and arranged for the collective farms to be set a wildly unrealistic target of delivering 356 million pud of grain. This was the second piece of evidence cited by the 2010 Kyiv court judgment against Chubar. In December, Chubar had another clash with Yakovlevich, who complained that fines imposed on peasants who failed to deliver their quota of grain were not being collected. Chubar argued that the peasants were so poor they had nothing that could be confiscated and sold. He was overruled, and signed an order that penalized 3 entire regions, Chernihiv, Kyiv and Vinnytsia, that were accused of, maliciously, failing to fulfill their quotas by prohibiting the sale of potatoes, which inevitably caused starvation, which the 2010 court verdict described as murder by famine of Ukrainian peasants. Assessing his role in Holodomor, historian Robert Conquest wrote, Chubar, who had expressed doubt or rather certainty that Moscow's policies would lead to disaster, nevertheless enforced them. In 1934, Chubar was transferred to Moscow. This was because Stalin no longer trusted him. He was appointed to a senior post as deputy chairman of the USSR Council of People's Commissars and deputy chairman of the USSR Council of Labor and Defense. In February 1935, Chubar was made a full member of the Politburo. He briefly served as the Soviet People's Commissar of Finance between August 16, 1937, and January 19, 1938. He supported Stalin in the early stages of the Great Purge. During the Central Committee plenum, in February 1937, which sanctioned the arrest of Nikolai Bukharin and other former opponents of collectivization, Chubar made a provoking speech accusing them of open counter-revolution, and calling Bukharin a snake, and alleging that Trotsky and his supporters were agents of fascism. In 1938, Chubar was appointed the chief of the Solikamsk construction for the Gulag of Soviet Commissariat of Interior, and there he was arrested in June 1938. In 1956, the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, told delegates to the 20th Party Congress that Chubar's case had been handed to the notorious torturer Boris Rodos, who had orders to force a confession out of him. The head of the NKVD, Lavrent Beria, also arranged a confrontation in his office with Chubar's former colleague and neighbor Nikolai Antipov, who had broken under interrogation and had testified against Chubar, who reportedly exclaimed, "I cherished this snake next to my heart, provocateur." Molotov justified Chubar's arrest, years later, by saying, "He was with the rightists, we all knew it, we sensed it." Vlas Chubar was executed in Moscow, on February 26, 1939, aged 48. The Soviet government cleared Chubar of all charges. During the first wave of de-Stalinization in 19